and the Social Justice Committee at Shelter Rock for co-sponsoring this as part of a series of conversations. And I wanted to, as Michelle said, remind people to put their questions in the chat feature, and that we'll have a question and answer period as we go along. I wanted to introduce our guest, Robby Jones. Robert P. Jones is the CEO and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute and the author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, which won the 2021 American Book Award. And Robby serves as a lecturer, researcher. He regularly speaks on politics, culture, and religion. He writes for The Atlantic online, for NBC Think, and other outlets. He's frequently featured in major national media, such as CNN, MSNBC, and NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others. He's also the author of The End of White Christian America, which won the 2019 Grawemeyer Award in Religion. He writes weekly at Robert Jones at Substack.com, a newsletter which is dedicated to the work of truth-telling, repair, and healing from the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity. Robby holds a PhD in religion from Emory University, a Master's of Divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and a BS in computing and mathematics from Mississippi College. So as you can see, extremely well-rounded person with many interests. So let's talk now about the book and just have some general discussions about how people interacted with the material. So I guess I wanted to start by saying, Robby, that you talked about in the book about the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity. And you give some examples of those. What are the things that really stick out to you as something that people perhaps see clearly or don't see clearly or don't understand how embedded this history of white supremacy is in American Christianity?
Yeah, great. Well, it's a great place to start. So thank you for that introduction. Very much appreciate it. So glad to be here with you all. And I want to thank the Unitarian Universalist Veatch program at Shelter Rock, which helps fund PRRI's organization and our research, much of which appears in the book. But I think I'll start. This book is, I have on my social science hat, which I wear at PRRI in my day job. I've done more history in this book than, I'm not a historian, I'm a sociologist by training, but I've done more history in this book than I've ever done, including like digging through the archives at the United Daughters of the Confederacy headquarters, like that kind of archival work. But this book is also very personal. So it's probably about 25% memoir. And I'll start there, that it is very personal, and it's really the story of my own family. I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, for the most part, with deep family roots on both sides of my family back to Macon, Georgia. And in fact, those roots go back to the early 1800s. And so just one artifact, that are two artifacts that I think kind of give the contradictions here in my own family's life. On the one hand, I have this treasured family Bible that's been passed down on my mother's side of the family, actually from mother to daughter. When I went to seminary, my mother passed it on to me, and it's dated 1815. And it tells the story of my mother's side of the family, and it's got in between the Old and New Testaments this records page, right, of births, deaths, marriages, that kind of thing, that for generations. And this is the Bible's owner's name was Pleasant Moon. It's a British name on that side of the family. And again, a very treasured thing. As I was doing some research for the book and genealogical research, I came upon another artifact from that same family tree, and it was an estate settlement from my sixth great uncle, who was actually the namesake of my fifth great grandfather, who owned the Bible, Pleasant Moon. So this was his uncle, and one of the first generations to come down to Georgia from Virginia. and it listed everything in that person's household when he died. And he died in 1815, the same year the Bible was printed. And on that household are things like, one bay mare, one feather bed, 6 chairs, it lists like literally everything in the household. But among all of these goods, and actually the title of that document is The Goods and Chattels of Pleasant Moon, 1815, are 4 human beings listed on that register. And when you look at it, this was again, we were not my family was not the Gone with the Wind planter class. This was more like the yeoman farmer class. So when you added up all of those goods, all of those items in that list, they only added up to about $50,000 in today's money, right? So not extremely wealthy by any stretch. But what was notable about that is that the human beings in that list comprise 70% of the assets of that family, right? And so thinking about that even at that level, kind of like yeoman farmer, maybe lower middle class family, that the economics only worked with enslaving other human beings. And that in the same family, right, that we were so proud of having this family Bible, and there's several Baptist ministers along the way whose names are in that family Bible, and this kind of pride, all mixed up in that was this legacy of enslaving other people and using the religion of that Bible to justify it, right? And I think that really was the heart for me of kind of this journey of trying to really face that seriously and not give Christianity a pass. And I think that's what's happened so often, is that at best Christianity seemed to have some kind of passive role and wasn't active. But when you really dig into the history, when you really understand what's there, it's not a passive role at all. It's a very active role. And in fact, I argue that Christianity is in fact the cornerstone of white supremacy in this country, and that it has provided the moral and religious justification for white supremacy, really, since it is the version of Christianity that lands on these shores, is one that is first and foremost committed to white supremacy. And so it really is trying to take an unflinching look at that truth and unpack it for what it means for us today.
Mm-hmm. And you do, in telling the story of your family, talk about what it means for us today. As you said, you did this research, this deep dive into history, to show the ways in which Christianity has been used to support white supremacy, how white supremacy then became locked to a certain vision of Christianity. So how do you feel people see that or don't see that, understand that or don't understand that? How is that capable of becoming dominant, but also not being obvious?
Yeah. Well, we've been pretty good at denying our history. Just to put a strong point on this, it wasn't until I was 20 years old and in seminary that I even learned the truth about my own home denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention. Right? I always grew up knowing we were Southern Baptists, but I just assumed that word Southern was a geographic descriptor, and that's merely all it meant. And it wasn't until I had a Baptist history professor that, put it to me straight and said, look, there's just no getting around it, that the founding of this denomination was explicitly to justify not just anyone, but to justify clergy enslaving other people, and that they could be valid and appointed to the clergy and to the mission field while enslaving other people. And that was the founding of the denomination in 1845. It turns out the other largest Protestant denomination, the Methodists, split that same year in 1845 along the same lines, north and south, Methodist Episcopal Church south and north, and then the Southern Baptist Convention, and then what became the American Baptist Convention in the north. And so I think we've been good at denying that history and trying to make that invisible. And we're seeing renewed efforts today to make it even more invisible to the next generation. We could talk about that later too. But I did want to look and see how you could detect this today in current public opinion attitudes. And I had seen some research. There's a great book called Deep Roots that actually looks at the correlations between slave owning levels at the county level in 1860 and attitudes today. and they did this phenomenal research, and you could actually draw causal lines, even controlling for all kinds of attributes, that the counties in the South that had the highest levels of enslaving other people in the 1860 census, today, the attitudes of white people in those counties today are considerably different than, and for instance, more likely to oppose affirmative action. They're more likely to identify as Republican, even today, than whites who lived in the county next door that had lower levels of enslaving other people. So that was sort of one jumping off point. I looked at attitudes, and just to kind of boil it down here, I looked at 15 different attitudes on race, racism, Confederate monuments of flags, the fairness of the criminal justice system to African Americans, the impact of past discrimination on current inequalities, and scaled them all together into one scale that I called the racism index, and I scored it 0 to 10. And then what I wanted to do is to see what work Christianity was doing among whites and influencing their attitudes. So I compared various groups of white Christians to whites who were unaffiliated to really see what the differences were, and it turned out to be very stark. Across all those questions, again, with 10 being holding the most racist attitudes, 0 holding the least racist attitudes, the 3 main groups of white Christians scored very, very high. So white evangelicals, the group that's in the South, the group that I, kind of my people that I grew up with, scored 8 out of 10 on that racism index. But what was maybe more surprising is that white mainline Protestants, that is the non-evangelical end of the white Protestant world, think Episcopalians, Presbyterians, and the like, UCC, scored 7 out of 10 on that scale. And white Catholics, who have their own history being persecuted in this country and being discriminated against, nonetheless scored 7 out of 10 on that scale. And when I looked at whites who were not Christian, they only scored 4 out of 10, and went through a lot of other analysis, but basically it's not just correlational. It's actually linked in a predictive sort of way. In other words, that knowing our race, holding more racist attitudes actually makes you more likely to identify as white and Christian than if you hold least racist attitudes. So Christianity is actually doing work, and kind of, so one way to boil it down is what the research shows is that if you take your average white person and you add Christian identity, they move up the racism index, not down, right? They become more racist, not less. I tried to boil it down. The book is it does have some technical analysis in it, but it's a popular book, not an academic book. So I tried to boil it really down here. And what I found, and when I tried to just kind of get it into common language, I put it 2 different ways. This is that the research shows 2 different things. That one, if you were trying to guess whether a person was going to identify as a white Christian, you'd be better off, and you want your guess to be the most accurate, you'd be better off knowing how racist they are than how often they go to church. The other way to put it, that's kind of indicates what the data says, is that if you were recruiting for a white supremacist cause on a Sunday morning, you'd likely have more success hanging out in the parking lot of your average white church, and that's white evangelical, white mainline, or white Catholic. You'd be better off hanging out in the parking lot of your average white church than you would be approaching whites who are sitting out services in the local coffee shop. And one last little caveat here that I think is really just so disturbing, really, is that it looks like church attendance among white evangelicals in particular makes things worse. In other words, the relationship between holding racist attitudes and identifying as a white evangelical is actually stronger among those who go to church more than it is among those who attend church less. And among white mainliners, white mainline Christians and white Catholics, church attendance essentially doesn't make much difference at all. And so I think that seeing that reality, in front of us, that those are among white Christians living and breathing today, that's the legacy of this history and how it still shows up in our current congregations.
Mm-hmm. In your book, you talk about how, there's a story. Every religion is a story. And you talk about how the length of the the lost cause of the Confederacy story and other stories come to be linked to Christianity. Are there particular stories that you think we're still telling, the narrative that people are hearing in those churches where you say that they come out with more racist ideology perhaps than they went into? What are they hearing there that's reinforcing that?
Yeah, let me just ask, there's something in the chat saying I'm breaking up a little bit. Is that other people hearing me break up? I'll switch microphones if that's the case.
Okay. We are hearing you well. We'll let you know.
Okay, great. That's great. Yeah, so I have a whole chapter on theology in the book, but it's actually more than just theology. I was struck, the only kind of graphic image in the book that's not a chart or a graph from the data is actually a full page sketch of a white Jesus emerging from the tomb. And it is taken from the journal of Dylan Roof. All right, so Dylan Roof is the person who gunned down 9 African Americans at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, and who was himself Christian. In fact, he was a confirmed ELCA Lutheran and a member of a church. And he, in this journal where he was writing this racist screed, really calling on white Americans to rise up and have a race war, and calling on Christians to be a warrior's religion and to follow his murderous example. So he has this picture of a white Jesus there, and it was very central actually to his understanding of white supremacy, that Jesus and Christianity were very much compatible with that view. So I think one of the ways we see it is in these images, stained glass or otherwise, of white Jesus, in churches. But it's one other quote that I thought was so insightful from Dr. Martin Luther King was in Letter from Birmingham Jail, when he's looking around Birmingham, right? And he's not writing that letter, of course, to the people spitting and to the KKK and people spitting and throwing bricks at him. He's writing that letter to the so-called respectable moderates in Birmingham, right? The moderate Jewish and Christian leaders in Birmingham with their pristine, chapels and education buildings. And he's kind of marveling, like, who are these people? What God do they worship, right? And then he has this phrase where he says, that these people are sitting safely behind the anesthetizing power of stained glass windows. And I've always thought that was so insightful that for me, I think that rings so true looking back on my, Christian upbringing in a white Christian church, that one of the things that happened was that church served to kind of filter out, like it was almost as if those stained glass windows were functioning as filters, and they would filter out any claims to justice, any ability to really see racial injustice. And what happened inside that church was all very personal, individual. It's about individual sin and individual piety that's really very divorced from biblical conceptions of justice, and certainly social justice or structural justice. Those things are utterly invisible. And those that really was the function that Christian theology did, and that it actually really, and I said this is no accident, that by design, right? If you have a theology whose primary commitment is the presupposition of white supremacy, then it can really only develop in certain ways, right? It has to protect that presupposition. And that one of the ways it did that was to kind of come up with this very personal relationship with Jesus. It's all about me and literally white Jesus. And if me and white Jesus are okay, nothing else really matters, right? It's really hard for anything else to kind of break through or penetrate in with that kind of theology, because it's just so closed and kind of, it's like a 1 foot radius around you is what you can see and what you're really responsible for. There. So I think that's just at least one way, the sort of iconography, and then this kind of theology of salvation that is so focused on individual things. And again, by no accident, this is by design, so that the broader structural claims just literally are screened out.
Well, in Unitarian Universalism, which is of course not exclusively Christian or majority Christian at this point, but it's also, and it's a liberal pluralist religious, but also steeped in that that history. where, you know, we don't have stained glass windows anymore, but we did in our older churches, and there were, you know, white Jesus, or there was an association with dominant culture still in our religious tradition. So I think this is important for people, as you're pointing out, to just look at the roots of where your faith tradition comes from. You can't go back and rewrite that history, but knowing it will help you see clearly where you are now, and then think about how you move forward. So in your book, as you present this, you know, history, and invite people to, you know, to really dig into the realities of their religious traditions, you also are talking about how do we undo? What do we do? How do we move forward? Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's great. You know, I think the first, there's kind of two moments here, as I've kind of try to learn from what people are doing on the ground, and what kind of distilled two moments, and they're really basically about truth telling and repair, or repentance and repair. And the truth telling, you know, piece of this, I think is kind of the prerequisite, right? It is a really doing the work so that we even see the things that we're talking about tonight. I think that's been the real power among many white Christians. Is there's one guy I was interviewing in Macon, Georgia, a predominantly white Baptist church in Macon, Georgia, and he said, you know, our biggest problem is that we see ourselves as good people who do good things. Like that's our self story, right? And as long as we're holding on to that, it's very hard. So the founders of our churches were all pillars of the community, you know, and in that particular church, I mean, you know, just as you said, digging into our own history, you don't have to dig far, I think, to find some pretty uncomfortable truths. And for this one church in Macon, it's actually the progenitor of my parents' church. They grew up in a church that was planted by my First Baptist Church in Macon. And, you know, in that church, what they did when they started digging into their own records, they found, for example, that in the, I think it was in the 1840s, the church was founded in the 1820s. In the 1840s, it got into debt and got into a pretty precarious spot. And it turned out that one of the things they did to balance the books was that they sold members of their own church, enslaved members of their own church. So at the time, they had on the rolls were white people and African Americans who were enslaved to those white people were all listed on the rolls of the church. And you can actually see in that year's ledger money coming in from the sale of their own members, and then it moving over to pay the pastor, to pay the mortgage, to pay off the bills, right? And this was something that I think the current church had no idea. Was they knew that the church had been you know, had been existed and founded when many of the members owned other human beings, but they didn't know that something this direct and really atrocious had happened in their own church's history. So I think, you know, digging into that, and really I've kind of said, look, if you, this would go for UUA churches as well. I mean, if every church, you know, in America just asked the question, like, why is our church on this piece of land? And just kind of just ask that simple question, right? Why not here and not somewhere else? Most people will get very quickly to, if it's, you know, a predominantly white congregation, it's in a predominantly white part of town. And that was because of the practice of redlining, right? Where non-white people were excluded from living in certain parts of the city. And were those parts of the city where they were excluded from were typically, they had better amenities. They had libraries and swimming pools and parks. They were not in flood zones. They were not near factories with pollutants and et cetera, et cetera. They were better residential areas in all kinds of ways. And that's part of the legacy, right? Of why if a church is out in the suburbs, it's usually because, if it's predominantly white church, it's usually because it followed white flight out to the suburbs from the middle of the city. So I think there's, yeah, you don't have to scratch very far, I think, to find this legacy just right up in our very recent history.
Right. So then after people know the history, how do you talk to people about moving into the repair?
Yeah, I think for many white congregations, and one of the things I've learned by sort of just observing what's kind of worked and where things have kind of blown up is what many white Christians want to do is to actually go straight to reconciliation. Say like, okay, let's confess, and then let's all be reconciled, and we're all good. And I think that formula, as we down in the South, we would call that cheap grace, right? Is a kind of way to talk about that colloquially, but because it skips the hard work, right? It really just says, okay, let's tell the truth, and then we're all going to be good, right? But it ignores the justice question, obviously, and it's also, if we're thinking kind of internal to the Christian tradition, really thin understanding of repentance. We have both the sort of Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, pretty clear admonitions put in the mouth of God, saying, look, if there's something wrong between you and your brother or sister, if you've wronged your brother or sister, don't come praying to me, right? Go make it right with them and then come back to the altar. That's the way to have an acceptable relationship with the divinity. But I think we haven't really taken that seriously. So I think the work is really about, and I've been kind of, as a result of this, urging predominantly white congregation, when I talk to them, to focus less on reconciliation and to really focus more on repair, with the idea really that if white people, white Christians, white religious people do enough of the work of repair, the reconciliation piece is actually going to take care of itself, right? But if we focus on the justice piece, we focus on repairing the damage and really, doing an accounting of that. What does it mean? This church in Macon, for example, that there's an African American church right around the corner that was actually, the relationship is when after the Civil War, the African American churches, like the African Americans in that congregation, moved out and started their own church. It's also called First Baptist Church in Macon, and they've had this relationship with each other for 150 years, sitting around the corner from each other. And the predominantly white church has a large endowment. The predominantly African American church has virtually none. So what's then the responsibility, right? Asking those hard questions, and what's required. And those are not easy questions, but I think having the courage to even ask those questions, put them on the table, and really wrestle with them, I think is really what, where the work really is.
Mhm, mhm. I think in our denomination, that's been one of the challenging things, is to say to people that there is no one way or clear way to do that reconciliation work. You just have to start down that road without knowing what the end is. And that's very difficult for people, that feeling of unsettledness, of not knowing how it's going to play out, creates frustration, aggravation, anger, fear, guilt, shame, all of that. Have you found that that's the kind of what you encounter when you're talking to people about reconciliation?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, when it starts costing people something, right, it gets harder. That's just the truth. And if we're honest about this, white supremacy has always been about goods and money and wealth and power. It's been about kind of hoarding those things, right, for people who could lay claim to being white. And so it's always been about economics. It's always, so we shouldn't, if the harm and the damage has been about economics, we shouldn't expect that the repair is not going to be about economics. So I think just being honest about that, and fairly straightforward about that, and having the courage to face it, I think is really part of the challenge. And one other thing I'll say here about it being a kind of open-ended process and that being important is that I think a lot of this work of repair is local, right? And it's at the congregational level or at the city level, because it's there that you can really tell the stories of what really happened. What is our history? What does our shared history look like? And I think that hopefully at this moment, it's funny. Like I think we can sometimes be very creative, but suddenly when money's involved, we get very unable to be creative all of a sudden, right? But I think we're really going to be called on to be creative here about there may be 100 ways, right, to do this work of repair. And I think we ought to let 1,000 flowers bloom on this front, but and to let the local context, I think, start informing what an appropriate kind of movement for repair is. That can be kind of exciting, can be rooted in, you know, community, and it can be you know, things that we don't think about until we've actually done the work of the truth telling and the history, because sometimes that context, the historical context, will kind of inform and give us some ideas about how to move forward.
Yes. Well, some of our questions have been about that. You know, the pushback against teaching critical race theory, or somebody's idea of what critical race theory might be. This whole idea about how hard it is for people to interact with history and to be, you know, to have those conversations. You know, when you're doing your research, do you find that there's a lot of pushback from people about what you're saying about the, I mean, just accepting of it as fact?
Yeah, well, I think there's been, you know, more ignoring than pushback on certain fronts. I mean, the data is pretty straightforward, and it's not just our data. I mean, you know, you can get these same results from a lot of different sources. So I think that means that people aren't quibbling at that level, pushing back at that level. I think there's just been, for example, among Southern Baptists, I think mostly crickets to this work. There have been individual Baptist churches. I mean, I was just in Missouri at Columbia, Missouri, at First Baptist Church in Columbia. That's really, you know, just a couple of months ago, that's trying very hard to have this conversation. First Baptist Church in Macon, Georgia, you know, is another one that I kind of actually hung out with a little bit while I was working on the book. So you know, I think there are these things happening, but I will say it is hard. I mean, there. If you're really doing it, I mean, there were certainly moments, even on for me working on the book, where I just had to put it down. Like, I marked out 8 hours to work on the book for the day, and I was at like hour 3, but the weight of it was just too much. Like, I really did have to just walk away and say, all right, you know, this is all I can do today, because it was really hard, you know, hard to take in, you know. And I mean, one personal story about my grandfather, I actually found out after the book from talking with my parents, but you know, it's painful to find out, for example, that my grandfather was a deacon at East Macon Baptist Church, and one of his roles on Sunday morning in 1962 or 63, the early 1960s, was to stand out on the front steps of the church and make sure that no one who wasn't white entered the sanctuary. And that was an official role of a deacon at East Macon Baptist Church in the early 1960s. Not some wink, wink, nod, nod thing, but like an official role for a deacon of the church. And to, you know, think about how twisted that is, you know, and that it was just so ingrained that people didn't see it, that my own family didn't see it, just, you know, 2 generations back. So yeah, I get that it's hard, but here's the one thing I think that many white people have not gotten, and particularly white religious people or white Christians, is haven't quite become convinced. And I hope this is one piece of work that the book does, haven't been quite convinced that we have anything at stake in this conversation, right? That okay, well, yes, we should repent, we should tell the truth, but it's really for the sake of other people that we've harmed that we should tell the truth, right? It's for the sake of African Americans, and it's essentially understood or cast as an optional act of altruism on our part, right? That we should do, but you know, if we don't, no big deal. And I think what you know, James Baldwin was really helpful to me in this front in getting this right, that I think white Christians have not really understood the damage, deep structural damage that we have done to our own faith. Right, as a result of allowing white supremacy to be the presupposition, the foundation upon which everything else was built. That was the one thing that couldn't be questioned. And if you take that really seriously, you know, that means we've got a lot of work to do. And if we don't do it, we're going to hand down a very disfigured, twisted faith to the next generation, right? To our kids. So I think it is about kind of getting people to understand that there's important work to do. And yes, there is this work of repair and work of mending relationships out there. but there's this work in here that has to be done if we're going to have any hope of having, an authentic religious life.
Yeah. So you're pointing out both what white Christians have to do, sort of their internal work, and asking for there to be some relational work in the repair. And some of the questions people are asking, there is often this idea, and I'll say, on behalf of Unitarian Universalists, I will acknowledge this. We often go off to be the savior of others, and not necessarily letting others lead or be in deep relationship with people when trying to do justice work or racial reconciliation work. So, do you know of any programs or groups? Someone has mentioned the Episcopals reconciliation. Do you have any comments on any programs that you think, or policies that you think are working?
Yeah, and so I'm glad somebody brought up the programs in the Episcopal Church. What I think is important about them is there's one here in Maryland, in the Diocese of Maryland, where I'm living now, that they're seriously about money. That they really are taking the reparations question seriously. Now, is the scale right? I think probably not. But I think it's not negligible either. And so I think that that's a really great example. The ELCA, the Lutheran Church, I mentioned them before because Dylan Roof was a member of that denomination, also took that event seriously. The media didn't really cover it. That he himself was, a kind of baptized white Christian and Lutheran. And but the denomination, to its credit, I think did take it up and has launched a whole series of programs, some of which are about truth telling in their own history, some of which are about reparations, and those are ongoing. I think those are happening. Some of you may have seen just this week in Tulsa, there's a lawsuit that's moved more forward than any effort has about getting reparations for, I think there are now only 3 remaining survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. But finally getting some reparations money moved to those folks. My wife's from Evanston, Illinois, and the city of Evanston has tried to come up with a program for people who are denied housing on the basis of race, or denied loans. And that they can actually get assistance with house payments, with down payments, those kinds of things. Now, if they can show that they're either they or their ancestors were denied access to those things on the basis of race. So I think there are a lot of different ways to go here, but I do think that there are some both inside and outside the church that are serious. But I also think that this is a good question for the UUA and for the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church. Places that have, hundreds of millions of dollars in endowments, I really do think we're going to have to seriously ask the question about what divesting some of those endowments is going to mean or should mean. Because that's where, if you think about, this kind of idea of hoarding illegitimate wealth, right? Wealth that's been stolen in many ways on the backs of other people's labor. And then accrues over time, right? Bears interest and just builds up over time. That's a really serious question. And there's just, like hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in those endowment funds, and whether they should be kept locked up or whether some portion of them should be shared with the descendants of people who were deprived of those funds in the first place.
Yes, I know that Harvard has put together a program recently, and that university has very strong Unitarian roots, and so it might be interesting for us to look at that as denomination. So I see there were some questions. There's a question actually about culture. Someone was wondering if you thought there might be a shift in sort of Southern white Christian culture with people moving down to the South from the Northeast the sort of the reverse migration that some people are doing, if you thought that that might change the culture, at least shake it up a little bit.
Yeah, I think it already has. Just in one way you can see this, particularly in the Deep South, is that where many of those people are landing, of course, is in the major urban areas in the South. So Atlanta, Nashville, Austin, Houston, Dallas, the Research Triangle, North Carolina, and what we're increasingly seeing in the South as a result of this is this urban rural divide that's just huge, right? It's Atlanta versus the rest of the state. It's Nashville versus the rest of the state, and you see that even in Virginia, like it's Northern Virginia versus the rest of Virginia, right? Around the DC area and the like. And so I think that's the current dynamic of it, is that we're seeing that going on. And I think increasingly too, especially, I lived in Atlanta for a while. I was going to grad school. And there, it wasn't just black, white, right? It was a big Latino influx of Latinos, big influx of people from Cambodia, for example, in North Atlanta, that, and felt so much that people would assign derogatory like nicknames. So like I lived in Chambly, which is the name of the city, and people would derogatorily call it Cambodia, right? Because it had such an influx of Cambodian immigrants there. So I think, yes, we're absolutely seeing that. It is very much a different place. Even in Jackson, Mississippi, where I grew up, just outside in the exurbs now, there is a large Indian population, and they have now built a very large Hindu temple out in a pasture, right in Flowood, Mississippi. There's this gleaming white Hindu temple. They brought over artisans from India to kind of do the stone carving. So that it is really changing the landscape. And I'll say that I think one of the reasons why we're seeing our politics be so visceral right now, and particularly the backlash from white conservative Christians in particular, is exactly because of this, right? That there is a kind of sense that the country is changing, and it's not just changing in California and New York, right? It's changing kind of everywhere. And there is this reaction, this negative reaction to that, and this attempt to kind of hold on to the power of white supremacy, the power of a kind of normative white Christian America, that kind of ownership of America, particularly by white conservative Protestants, that is animating, our politics in these kind of dangerous and unsettling ways.
Yes, dangerous and unsettling ways. So in talking about the dangerous and unsettling ways in which we're operating now, do you see a possibility that if people do engage with the material that you're presenting in the book, they do allow themselves to learn the history, to understand the culture around them, that they can find a way to have less dangerous, contentious ways of having these conversations about, the history, about what's at the core of our country, about what's at the core of their religious beliefs? I think people often have fear about exploring, about finding out something that's bad about what's important to them, their faith, their community, their history, their culture. Have you seen people work with the material that you present in a way that helps them to get past that fear?
I think so. Like I said, I've been traveling a bit more in the last, in this year, and I think I've probably spoken to 100 religious congregations since the book came out. So that alone is different. I wrote a book called The End of White Christian America back in 2016. I came to talk, I think, to the congregation back then. There it was much more of a kind of academic circuit that I talked to. And I think one difference, and I think one sign of it, is that, there are a lot of congregations reaching out and saying, we really need to have this conversation. Can you come talk to us and help us along the way? So that's new, really. And so I take that as a good sign. And honestly, I think it's really hard with the just sort of constant, negative news that we're getting in many ways. It's just ugly, right? That's about, yes, trying to lay claim to this 1950s white Christian America, kind of resurgence in that way. But I do think that there's something to be said about that it is a backlash. I really do believe that. And so why do we see arguments about critical race theory, right, in 2021 and 2022? Well, it's because it's a direct response to the Black Lives Matter movement, right? That was pulling down monuments and trying to tell in the 1619 Project. And why is the 1619 Project being written into bills by name, saying that's the thing you can't teach, right? It's because it threatens this other narrative, right, of who we are. And so I think these kinds of big tectonic changes always come with a fight. But I take the fact that there's enough of a prevailing wind that that there is this national pushback to be actually in the long run a sign of hope, right? That there is enough change and enough pushing going on that it has caused this backlash. And I think it's a particularly dangerous and challenging time. But I think whenever we've been at these fulcrum moments, and I truly believe we are at one of these fulcrum moments, it's a fight, right? Because it's a shift. And it's one, that if we can kind of get through it, I think we'll be, better off. It doesn't mean future generations aren't going to have to fight other versions of this fight. I think they will. But I think this is the fight, for us in this moment today. But I think the fact that there's this much pushback means that there's this much of a prevailing wind.
Okay, I think I'm checking for questions. If anyone would like to put additional questions in the Q&A, that would be great. If you would do that now. Okay. Well, someone wants to, in talking about that pushback, have you experienced any personal pushback?
Oh, sure. Plenty of nasty voicemails and emails. I had to report somebody on Facebook last week who said me and my book should be burned alive. I mean, so those kinds of things, have not been, absent along the way. But I have to say that, they pale 20 to 1 the other way. That people saying thanks for helping us do this work and helping telling your own story, like those kinds of things. So yeah, absolutely. But I actually again take that to mean that it's touched a nerve, right, which it was designed to do.
Yeah, well, speaking of that, people who say thank you, do you feel that there is a growing sort of community of white Christians who want to leave white supremacy behind, who want to embrace a different kind of Christianity?
I do actually. I'm actually more hopeful about that than I really was when I turned. So I turned the manuscript of this book in 2019, right before George Floyd's murder, before kind of all the uprisings after that, and just I don't know, like Richmond, Virginia. I'll give you one quick story. So Richmond, obviously, the monuments, right, have all been pulled down in Richmond. In the last one, took a while to get the Robert E. Lee statue down, but it's finally down. And by the way, just a little mark of trivia, the only statue still standing on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of the Confederacy, is a statue to Arthur Ashe Jr., the African-American tennis star who's from Richmond. So there's some irony about that he's raising a tennis racket at the end of Monument Avenue on the last traffic circle out there. It feels like a little bit of a victory there. But First Baptist Richmond was a church that was so steeped in white supremacy that it goes back pre-Civil War, that during the Civil War they actually offered their church's bell to be melted down into cannon, right, for the Confederate Army to kill other people in the name of protecting their right to enslave other people. That church was so committed, even in the 20th century, to white supremacy, that it moved it relocated itself from downtown Richmond out onto Monument Avenue to be literally in the shadow of the Stonewall Jackson monument that was being put up in that intersection. Like that, it literally moved on Monument Avenue to be in the shadow of the Confederate monuments. So it was like looking right at it. But in 2020, when that statue was removed, the staff of First Baptist Richmond actually rang the bell in solidarity and support of that statue coming down. Right. So it's slow. It's not what it needs to be by any stretch of the imagination. But there are, I think, a growing chorus of people who are doing it. And I think what's important about it actually is that it's happening at the local level and not just up in the denominational offices. I think it's one of the big failures of the civil rights movement in white and at the National Council of Churches and white denominations is that if you only read the press releases that went out from the big denominations in the National Council of Churches, you would think that every white Christian was at every civil rights march. If you just read those press releases from the denominational offices, but churches at the local level routinely ignored them, particularly in the South. And my favorite example of this, the Episcopal Church, is the Episcopal Church. Member of the National Council of Churches, was partially responsible for having Martin Luther King come speak at the National Council of Churches, having him write in the Christian Century, their kind of flagship magazine. And the same year they have him come speak at the convention at the National Council of Churches. An Episcopalian school, the Lovett School in Atlanta, denies admission to his son on the basis of race, right? So this kind of local national disconnect, I think, was just everywhere. So I think what gives me some hope is that this is actually local congregations. It's also often lay-led and not just pastor-led. I think it's hopeful as well.
Yes, the both and is necessary. So I think that people did want to know if you have any guidance for how they might personally begin this work.
Yeah, I mean, I think, from my own experience, it was starting with my own story. So it was my family, my church, my denomination, and it was really trying to get it as personal as possible and as close to home as possible. Like I said, I do think it's not as hard as it feels a little overwhelming to like, oh, well, it's so big, like, where do I start? But I really do think starting with stories, starting with the personal, starting with the local, I think that's really the way in, right? Because then you have skin in the game, literally have skin in the game. And it's not abstract. It's really concrete.
Yes, that's great. I know that you talk about white Christians, but I think that it's also the case that, as there are Jewish congregations, Muslim congregations, as everybody comes into the US context, they all get sort of pulled into the racism and white supremacist part of the culture. So I think that although your work is based in this mostly Southern, but this white Protestant Christian, and you talk a little bit about Catholicism, which I think is sort of that model too. It comes in and then it gets sort of pulled into the way we do things here. I do think that other faith traditions can learn from your work how they're going to be pulled into this if they're not attentive.
Yeah, I was really struck by Catholics and Jews in particular, because those are two groups that 100 years ago were not considered white. And I think that's really worth remembering, right? Italians were not white. Jews were not white. And part of the bargain that got struck, and again, Baldwin's pretty clear about this too, in writing about the kind of relationship between African Americans and Jews in Harlem, that part of the temptation, I think, for Catholics, Catholics and Jews, was that part of the bargain that got struck was to be admitted into the realm of legitimate religions in America, part of the price of that ticket was being white, right? And so, and there came all kinds of privileges with that. You know, so being able to kind of claim whiteness in a way that their parents and grandparents weren't able to, move them into mainstream, access to power, access to all neighborhoods, better schools, all that stuff came along with that. You know, and there's, I think that's one of the things we're still struggling with, you know, that kind of, there was an important move middle of the 20th century to kind of push back against anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic forces in America that were rampant in the 1920s and 30s. And that was really important, but the model that got pushed forward was a kind of Judeo-Christian America was the model, right, for bringing in Jews and Catholics. I think that model has far run its course, and we've got to have something different today that doesn't really depend on this kind of whiteness as being part of the price of the ticket, of kind of being admitted as being legitimate. And I think there's probably some lessons there for the UA world as well.
End of our time, and I want to know if you had want to leave us with any closing remarks.
Yeah, I'm going to leave you. With something as a lot of it's been kind of challenging and maybe not the brightest talk tonight, but I'll leave you with a hopeful note from Brother Baldwin here. You know, he was I think clear-eyed about it. He wasn't blindly optimistic, but I think he did, even in his day, you know, seeing King gunned down and you know, steps forward, steps back. But I think that the one thing I'll leave with him is from the Fire Next Time, some hopeful notes that he said, you know, if we can find the courage and love to do this work, that we might just end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world.
Wow. Wow. That would be something. So I want to thank our guest, Robert Jones, for being here with us. He's the author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, which has been part of our racial justice book discussion group led by PRRI for this last month. And I hope that if you haven't read it, that you all pick up the book and give it a read. So I thank you again on behalf of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation at Shelter Rock, the Veatch program at Shelter Rock, and Shelter Rock's Social Justice Committee.
Thank you all.
Thank you.